All right, there you go.
Perfect, thank you. BFAC aims to ground itself in a power sharing model that honors and values all all voices at the table, treating each with dignity and respect, and is trauma informed and self-critical. The BFAC seeks to offer a space to help provide an equitable, community-centered platform for food access, affordability, and economic opportunities. That is our value statement. Is Yasser with us?
Yasser had an emergency come up, so
Okay, I can actually. So in this portion, what we're asking is if you do have any community updates that you would like us to share, you can actually inbox myself, Cheryl Jean, and to direct message. And then at the end of this meeting, we'll make time to speak about any community updates. Shauna?
Yes. All right. So we BFAC held our inaugural community food collaborative convening on Wednesday, February 15th. It was a really great gathering of folks from across the Boston food access world to kind of ground us in our topic pieces. So the community food collaborative model is meant to bring us together based on a topic, have a conversation around that topic, and then bring both organizations and other stakeholders and community members together to work and take next steps on that topic. We will be activating our policy and advocacy working group for this sort of for these next pieces. On February 15th, we had Celia Grant from Daily Table, Vicky Nijis from Mass Law Reform Institute, and Musu Masakua from the BFAC Steering Committee speaking about dignity and SNAP transactions. A lot of great information came up in this conversation. If you'd like to receive both, we'll send out the recording and other follow-up information after tonight's meeting. So please make sure that you're on the Boston Food Access Council mailing list, and we'll get additional information out. But really the way to follow up with the community food collaborative work and these next steps around SNAP, keeping in mind that the emergency allotments ended this past week and will really impact quite a few of our neighbors. We invite you to our March 21st policy and advocacy meeting, and more information will come there. Does anyone else want to share any pieces? Here's another piece around the model for the community food collaborative. So really we started out in the gather and collaborate piece, and then the next steps will be to refine and solve, really have those topic-based specific conversations. And then the work is to engage stakeholders and enact solutions and next steps. And always we're looking to enact change and push pieces forward. The piece, as you see at the top of this, as we work through this model and use it more often, we will be surveying across stakeholders in order to identify topics. And Christine, I don't have the date for the next community food collaborative in front of me.
Next slide.
Oh, well, I do have it in front of me. I was just kidding. So June 15th. We will, please help us to decide. We'll be working through this survey and putting it out amongst all of you and asking you to help us to identify the next topic. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to everyone who participated in the CFC in February, and to everyone who I know is going to join the Policy and Advocacy Working Group on the 21st to take some next steps around SNAP. There's a lot of work to be done around both SNAP and HIP over these next few months. And as we start pushing for the Farm Bill and other pieces in the local and national food system. So there we go. All right. We've got the Office of Food Justice with us this evening. Ryann and Eliza.
Hi, thanks so much, Anna. If we could have share screen access, that'd be great.
And while we are getting those slides up, I will say hello. Really glad to be with you all tonight. For folks I haven't met before, my name is Eliza Wasserman, the Director of the Office of Food Justice. Really glad to see or hear how many folks are here tonight. It's very encouraging. What I'll just actually introduce, so there's two other members of my team here tonight, Ryann Kim, who is putting up the slides, our Deputy Director, and then a newer staff member, Laura Alves, a Manager of Strategic Initiatives, who joined the team in January, is also here. So hoping folks will be able to, meet Laura in person in the future. And as we have more opportunities to work together. So we're gonna give some updates. I think it's actually been, it's been a while since we gave one of these general updates. I think it was actually when I had just recently started in my role this past summer. So it's really nice that there's a lot more familiar faces tonight that I've been able to meet and in some cases work with in the interim. So we're going to share I'm going to share some general updates. I guess, if you want to move to the agenda, just some of the topics we want to focus on. Some general updates about what our office has been up to and strategic priorities that we have been working to develop over the past 6 months. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Good Food Purchasing Program, which we have just started the implementation of in the past few months, and then want to share a little bit of information about the SNAP emergency allotment cliff that Shauna mentioned and some of the efforts in the city that we are trying to address the impact on Boston residents. So I guess just want to share before moving to the next slide. Thanks, Ryann. So just for folks who are newer to our office, we have partnered very closely in the past with BFAC. We were the Office of Food Access until just about a year ago, when we became the Office of Food Justice with a slightly expanded scope to include more of a holistic understanding of sort of that intersection of the full food system and a justice lens, particularly a racial justice lens. I would say 2022 was a big year of transition for our office, both in terms of our mission, what part of the city government we live under, our staff, a lot of staff transitions, and so have been spending a lot of time in the past 6 months really trying to orient towards where we're going and sort of give us a solid footing to be able to do the work moving forward, serve our office infrastructure. We actually moved down the hall during that period for folks who have been on the 8th floor of City Hall, where you might have found us before. We're still on the 8th floor, but down the hall. And we have 2 new staff who joined the team in the beginning of 2023. I mentioned Laura Alves, who's here, manager of strategic initiatives. And we also have a new program coordinator who has been with the team for about 2 weeks, Emily Sinsky, who's going to be working very closely with the farmers market, with the farmers markets in general, specifically with the farmers market coupon program and the Double Up Food Bucks program that is a SNAP incentive program. So one of the things that we have been working on, as I mentioned in throughout the past 8 months, if you can go to the next slide, and is kind of what is our strategic direction for our office, and jointly with Grow Boston, the city's Office of Urban Agriculture, which is a separate office, but we have a very intertwined mission around food justice. Grow Boston is a close partner of ours, and so we wanted to really develop a united kind of vision. So some folks heard us share some about this in the fall, but I kind of wanted to give a little bit of an update. Some of the direction, the newer strategic directions for our office that are building on our existing food access work. The first one, city leads by example with its procurement. So going to speak more about that today around the Good Food Purchasing Program. So I'll not get into detail right now, but the idea is if we can kind of get over the next several years, really assess and shift how public dollars for food are being used to better align with food system, a values-based food system, that we also could encourage shifts of other institutional purchasers in the city. If you think about like how many sort of buyers at a large scale exist in Boston relative to the whole regional food system, we could have collectively a pretty big impact. So we're sort of exploring what would be the best things for the city to do to have an impact there, given that other people, there are other organizations that have already been working with large institutions around values-based food purchasing for many years. The next one, looking at how we are increasing food recovery, especially in conjunction with the growing need the emergency food system has for fresh food. And then, as I mentioned, partnering with Grow Boston really closely. So their mission is essentially, and I'll just give a shout out that we have at least one member of the Grow Boston team, I'm seeing 2 squares from the Grow Boston team here tonight, Khalees Allen and Cassidy Chang. So really glad you guys are here as well. So partnering with them to increase food production in the city and specifically supporting neighborhood level growing, including on public land like the parks. And then finally, how do we build on our existing work to increase equitable food access, to really look at like what are the food access and distribution systems, and how do we look system level to really continue what we've been doing, but in a way that also incorporates a food system lens, essentially. So we are still kind of working to move to a close of our strategic planning process. Like we have some large goals identified, but what we still need to do to complete it is really hone in on the strategies that we're going to focus on over the next several years and how we're going to measure progress, because we don't want to set goals and then they just go into the ether and we have no ability to actually measure whether what our progress has been, and that it takes time to figure out, well, what is actually measurable, especially when you're looking at food justice kind of a little bit removed from the very sort of basic things that folks are already measuring. So we hope to wrap that process up in the next couple of months, and have some more kind of concrete stuff to share with BFAC, but wanted to focus for the next little while of this conversation on good food purchasing, because that is the most concrete piece we've been able to move forward so far. I think if folks have questions, feel free maybe to put them in the chat, and then we can see at the end if there's a few minutes. Would love to try to answer them, but I don't want to go on too long. So let me go to Good Food Purchasing Program. And
Real quick, Eliza, hey, there's someone in the waiting room. I know that you guys have a host now. If you could let them in.
Sure, sorry about that. I didn't realize I was the one holding that up. I'll do that right now.
Thanks, Cheryl. So what I'm going to be talking about is the Good Food Purchasing Program, which the city actually passed an ordinance in 2019 to create a Boston Good Food Purchasing Program. I think probably at least a few of you here were involved, or your organizations were involved in the advocacy to get that ordinance passed. So thank you for doing that, because it means that we have a really clear mandate for this to be a city-wide priority, which is pretty unique. So most cities, well, before I get into, yes, this basically what this means is it's a city-wide effort for any departments that are purchasing large, basically have large food contracts, to really look at how that food purchasing can be more values aligned. And it's really an effort that is focused on cities and counties across the country that have adopted good food purchasing. And so what I was going to say is there are not that many jurisdictions that have actually have it codified in an ordinance so early on, which is a really unique opportunity that we have. So I guess if you can go to the next slide, Han, I'll share a little bit about kind of what this means, values-based purchasing. So the idea is across all of the areas that we know that the food system has really significant impacts. How do we look across all of them to understand not just like one area, like not just the environmental impact, not just the impact on labor, but sort of all of these different areas. And so this approach was started by a nonprofit based in Los Angeles called the Center for Good Food Purchasing. And they work with cities like Boston to take a look at, yes, Jesse, we could definitely share these slides. They work with cities like Boston to assess the sort of existing purchasing that has happened historically, that's sort of like anything at a large scale. So in Boston, that is primarily Boston Public Schools is far and away the largest part of city government that is purchasing food, but there are a few other departments that work with sort of across the lifespan from kids to seniors that have sort of large enough food purchasing that we would look at it, but we've been starting with Boston Public Schools because sort of for obvious reasons, it's just like the vast majority of the food. So the idea is to sort of assess the impact of existing and previous procurement, and then do assessments periodically to actually see how procurement changes can shift the impact on the food system. So here, these are the sort of value categories that the Center for Good Food Purchasing looks at. And there's a note that the ordinance in Boston also includes a commitment to racial equity and supplier diversity, which the center is working to build into their framework in the future. But this is sort of a little bit unique to Boston at this moment. And so the process, what this really means for City of Boston work on the next slide, is that, so as I mentioned, there's been an ordinance in place. The first step in implementing the ordinance is that the Center on Good Food Purchasing worked with Boston Public Schools Food Nutrition Services to do an assessment, a baseline assessment of food purchases from basically the year right before the pandemic to see how sort of values aligned those purchases were. And then the next steps are sort of taking a look at that data to see what changes can be made. So like, how did we do? And then sort of planning shifts. Now, for anybody who knows about large scale procurement, especially in government, it's really complicated. And then if you layer on the layer of federal school meal reimbursement, it's even more, I would say, constrained and complicated because of the price per meal that districts are reimbursed by the federal by USDA, as well as what's sort of like available to meet nutrition standards, and kind of a bunch of other pretty complicated constraints. So the action planning, I guess, is more complicated than one might think. And that's kind of what we're starting to understand right now. But what will be moving forward pretty soon is that we are going to be sharing the initial assessment, the baseline assessment that was done. It should be on our website later this week. We're just kind of making final, tweaks to grammar and making sure that the right folks have looked at it and all of that, as well as some kind of additional contextual information about like, why is the city doing this, and more additional information that we've been putting together that will help people understand what the assessment means, because it's very technical. So what we got from the Good Center on Good Food Purchasing is it's very technical to the point where like you have folks who have been working in food systems for decades, and it can still be difficult to understand. And it's really important to us that the public can be engaged in this process in Boston, which is also somewhat unique compared to other cities. So we really want to try to make the language and the concepts as accessible to folks as possible who aren't necessarily like thinking about organic food or labor practices all day. So I guess, next steps on that are that will be shared on our website. And then there's going to be, as part of the requirements set out by the ordinance, there will be a city council hearing on it. We don't have a date yet, but it will be sometime, fingers crossed, in April, depending on some of the complexities of the budget hearings that they have to hold and just how tight the schedule is. We're sort of still working out the details around the public process for that, but we can definitely send BFAC an update when we have that information. And just to move towards wrapping up real quick with this, essentially the ordinance has a few components. I probably should have started with that, but basically so the goal is that over the next few years, we phase in these baseline assessments for every city department that has large food contracts. Then, each department is going to work with the Center on Good Food Purchasing to see what changes can be made to procurement. And then there'll be regular updates or regular assessments periodically to see, okay, like how did we do? Where are we making progress? What's harder? Where do we need to, shift things more? And then we also are going to be setting up a community advisory council, which is sort of the last piece of the ordinance to help really center this on transparency, both transparency into the food system, but also into the city's procurement practices for food. So we're sort of in process right now trying to figure out what that structure will be for that group, because it doesn't specify a whole lot in the ordinance, and we want it to be as meaningful a role as possible, which is challenging given state procurement laws and city procurement practices. So we're in process, I would say, with the overall implementation, but we're really glad that we will be able to share the assessment, the baseline assessment publicly. As I said, we were hoping to have it live by this meeting, but it just, the last few steps, everyone's got a lot going on, but so it will be later this week. And yeah, we'll definitely keep folks posted, because we'd like to engage BFAC as much as possible as we move into sort of aspect of public process around this. Yeah, I think I want to pivot to the next topic. I know folks might have questions about this, so I'll put my email in the chat. And Laura's leading the work on this. So between me and Laura, maybe you feel free to like follow up with us if you have questions. I will say, yeah, I'll just say again that what we're going to share publicly is very, the report is very technical. And so we really tried to create like companion and documents and FAQ pieces that can help people understand like the context of how we did. For instance, I'll just, not to get into the weeds, but there was a lot of data missing based on just how vendors generally operate in the food system. And so there's a lot of things in the assessment that like don't totally make sense without the context of like, there was a lot of missing data. And that's something that is part of this process, not just the procurement changes, but is like working with vendors to help them see, like, we need to know the location of everything that you procured for us, like a distributor. And that's not common practice, right? For like any government, like large entity, it's not something distributors are used to. And this is something like all of the jurisdictions that have started this good food purchasing have faced. So there's just sort of a lot of these steps that are pretty boring at the beginning that will make it more meaningful in the long term. And yeah, I know, I feel like I can't actually see the time on my screen. Yeah, so let me move forward to wanting to speaking a little bit about the SNAP emergency allotment benefit cliff. I know we had one more slide, but I know we're probably getting close on time. So yeah, so Shauna mentioned this. I know that BFAC has covered this recently, so I won't dwell on it too much, but we, just wanted to highlight the last extra COVID SNAP payment ending as of this month, and the fact that we're aware and we're concerned about the significant impact on Boston residents. The estimates are that it will be about $14 million a month in emergency SNAP benefits that were going to Boston households and as of this week, that, folks will really start to see the impact in April. And we know that it will be, obviously individuals trying to make ends meet, seeing the impact, as well as the emergency food system and, stores that are actually, businesses in the city that are, a lot of their customers are paying with SNAP, and just knowing that given food prices, we want to do everything we can to try to ease the burden that we know is coming. Next slide. So, one of the things that we're appreciative that the state has shared a lot of information about, that we're also working to get the word out through partners and other city departments, is how folks can, who are SNAP recipients currently, can work with the state, with the Department of Transitional Assistance, to see if they may be eligible for a higher regular benefit than they would be getting due to medical costs or housing costs. And this is information that the state has created a number of resources for. So really, if you are participating in SNAP, or you have family, friends, or folks that you work with, or if you're representing an organization works with, if you are able to share the resources that Ryann just put into the chat, there's like a whole variety of ways to get the word out, from flyers to a lot more detailed information, that like email scripts, robocall script, various things, to kind of help people understand what they might be able to do to address the decrease in their benefit level. So the main information that we, besides, sharing the state resources that we're sharing, again, sort of getting the word out through different city channels, is for anyone 60 or older in Boston, the best thing that they can do, who is a SNAP participant who's trying to figure out like what to do about this, the best thing they can do is call the Age Strong Commission, which actually is an outreach and enrollment site, partner of the state. And so they can actually help people make direct contact with DTA to see if they're eligible for an increased regular benefit. And then in SNAP outreach teams from Project Bread, the Greater Boston Food Bank, and ABCD Connect are really good resources. The state also has its own phone line and a senior assistance line, but we know that there may be like pretty long wait times as folks are trying, concerned and trying to figure out what to do. And so we want folks to have the resources that they need to try to get their needs met as promptly as possible. And so these are partners who are designated by the state to be able to work with individuals and follow up on their cases. And I think that we have one more slide, but so again, would encourage folks to share the resources from the state that Ryann put in the chat, and we are just past our time. So thanks for all of your partnership. Again, my email is there in the chat. Thanks, Ryann. So feel free if you do have questions about anything to follow up. And I'm just really glad to be here in partnership and looking forward to more soon.
Thanks, Elisa. Cheryl, it looks like you are host now.
Okay, so
You can also make me host if you want to, but you can.
Okay, yeah, let me do that. Hold on, let me.
Sorry about that. I jumped the gun.
No problem, no problem.
Thanks so much. That was really comprehensive. And
Perfect.
please reach out with questions. And one more note, we did update the survey for the CFC, and I'll put that further down in the chat later. But that is now working. It's a very quick survey, so we'll put that in the chat in a little bit. But now it's time to hear from Ryann, who's going to speak about principles of Indigenous food sovereignty. So let me make you, I should have actually done this. Change the host again. There we go. Passing the baton over to you, Ryann.
Thank you. All right, let me just get my screen situation up. Oh, shoot. Okay, can everybody see the slide? Just the slide?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Jump to the wrong one. All right, so I'm just gonna assume that somebody will help out with the chat if any questions come up, because I can't look at everything all at once. But thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to have this really important conversation around Indigenous food sovereignty. My name is Ryann Montiero, and I will formally introduce myself on the next slide. But one of the reasons why this talk came about is because I see that there's a lot of interest in the topic and eagerness to take action around Indigenous food sovereignty, but there's a lack of foundational knowledge and cultural understanding and the context behind that is really critical to when wanting to be engaged with Indigenous food sovereignty or just food issues and working with and supporting and being an ally with Indigenous communities. So just wanted to preface that off with that, but I'm really excited for us to share this time together. So before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about myself and where I come from. Natasa Ryann, I'm called Ryann, but in community, I am Jane and Bear's daughter, Billy's granddaughter, Anna's great-granddaughter, one of many, I might add. I'm on Montiero, so when introducing yourself, usually Indigenous culture, identifying by who your family is very common. So if people don't know who a Montiero is, then we're like, oh, I'm a Martin. And if people don't know who a Martin is, I'm a Jeffers. And you go down the line. Our tribe is a matriarchal society and culture. So that means that it's through the mother. That's how you trace back your lineage traditionally. And my identity is layered and complex. So the slide that you see on the screen on the right-hand side is a Cape Verdean flag. My mother is Cape Verdean. If you've never heard of Cape Verde, but hopefully being in Boston, you have before. It's a series of islands off the west coast of Africa. On the top left-hand part of the screen, you see some cranberry bogs. So I grew up in Rochester, Massachusetts. If you drink cranberry juice or ever saw an Ocean Spray commercial, that's where they film them. In the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you see the Aquinnah Cliffs. And so my Wampanoag ancestral line is from Aquinnah. And so when introducing myself, and I'd say Utomas, Aquinnah, Wana, Cabo Verde, I'm saying that my blood and my DNA is from these places. It's from these islands in the Thai Boston, but I currently live in Boston. So land is going to be a really important common theme throughout talking about Indigenous food sovereignty. And I just think that it's important to understand like my identity and where that intersects. A lot of your Wampanoag people today have mixed ancestry with Cape Verdeans, and this is a huge influence of this was the whaling industry in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is a city in southeastern Mass, which was the whaling capital city of the world in the 1800s. The whale has cultural significance to Aquinnah. There's also economic interest in industry during that time period. So you see a lot of, now you see a lot of Cape Verdean Wamps. In the center of the screen is my great-grandmother, Anna Martin, with her uncle, Lorenzo Jeffers. And so I just share that picture because one, I love and miss my Nana, and two, to share our matriarch for the Montiero and the Martin line of our generation. Indigenous work is complex and layered. I've had my own challenges with it as I navigate myself as an Indigenous woman. So it's just really important for me that I set a foundation for all of you that it's an ongoing learning experience. For all intents and purposes, whether I'm speaking from as a Cape Verdean woman or an Aquinnah Wampanoag woman, for all intents and purposes, I'm considered an off-island kid. I wasn't raised on Martha's Vineyard. I wasn't raised in Cape Verde. And that has implications culturally, politically, it just, for whatever the chip falls, it has implications. And when we talk about why land is important, when we talk about displacement, whether it's economic or forced relocation or just for opportunities, it matters. And we're seeing a resurgence of cultural revitalization, and food sovereignty is part of that. So before we jump further in, I just want to acknowledge and thank the people that have contributed to this presentation. Today, it's me who is speaking, with the knowledge that I have gained and will share today comes from a lifetime of experience and observations, and also being in relation to my community, to mentors, to scholarship, to all of it. And so the knowledge that I share today doesn't start with me, nor will it end with me. It's simply passing through me. Learning and teaching is done in community, and I'm thankful to my community and for us to share space together today. So why land matters and why this is going to be such a huge theme when talking about Indigenous food sovereignty is that there are so many unique and nuanced challenges and barriers that comes with it when we start talking about working with and supporting Native communities. And yeah, we're just gonna jump into this. So I'm gonna spend just like a very short amount of time giving just like a little bit historical background, just so we can orient ourselves to the time period and kind of how we got to where we are today. So context matters, and every nation has its own experience with colonization. So something that people forget or just aren't consciously aware of if you're not living it or working with it every day is that colonization happened from multiple directions and from different countries. So if we remember that colonization kind of starts from east to west. So we start with the UK, the British, starting from the east coast of the United States, working their way westward. But from the south, from Mexico going up, colonization is Indigenous communities interacted with colonization from Spaniards. And then when we go up and over to what we call Canada now, they're experiencing colonization from the French. So this is why across what we call today the United States, what we call Turtle Island or Indian country, you have these different influences that are coming from, one, the time periods of colonization, the countries that perpetuated colonization, and the cultural influences that came with colonization. So this, how this kind of shows up further down the line is in kind of the mixing or the influences of food practices, ceremonies, how different Native nations adjusted, what things they rejected from colonizations, what resistance looked like. All of those things matters because we're dealing with different people at different time periods. I also think it's really important to remember that we have a saying in our culture that everything starts in the East. And so for the Wampanoag people and our relatives on the Eastern Seaboard to be hit with colonization first and working your way inland, that has implications as well, not just because of war and famine and hunger that was associated with that war and just that interaction with combat, but you have to remember that Native people have always been active people who migrate. Word travels. It wasn't just like, hey, one day in the Midwest, they're like, oh, who are these people that don't look like us? Different nations have heard about what's been happening in the East. If you're in the North, you've heard what's happened in the South. And so word travels. And so now the implications of that is that I think especially in New England, there's this conversation around like, well, where are the Indians? We're just Wampanoag people in general are seen as these people of the past. And it's because we don't have, our numbers are not in the tens of thousands like you'll see in the Southwest or in the Dakotas or up in Seattle. And it's because we were hit with that first wave of everything. And I think that also is really important context in terms of why or why not Indigenous food sovereignty is in a certain place or not in a certain place in relation to what's happening in an Oklahoma, or it's happening in a North Dakota, or in Tacoma, Washington. So just to keep that kind of like orientation in your head as to some of these contributing factors that we'll dive into later. Another thing that matters, unfortunately, is recognition. So there are federally recognized tribes and state recognized tribes, both of which that have their own set of advantages and disadvantages. And Indigenous people continue to be affected by borders and regions. This particular map shows how the Bureau of Indian Affairs divides Indian country into regions. And this is not traditional. Borders, whether they are geopolitical, cultural, or whatever, just aren't traditional. When we talk about Indigenous food sovereignty and we talk about our relations and being in relation to the land and why all of this matters, we would follow animals and then animal migration patterns as well. So on this screen, you're seeing the United States being divided by regions such as the Southwest, such as New England, the Midwest, the South. You have the Bureau of Indian Affairs that divides federally recognized tribes into your own region. And then you have states, right? We all know what states are. So there are over 570 federally recognized tribes. There are state recognized tribes, and then there are locally acknowledged tribes that say like, hey, we understand that this band of people, this is part of our nation, these are our people, whether or not they are recognized by the state or whether or not they're recognized by the federal government. But going back to why borders are so important and really detrimental to Indigenous food sovereignty is because one of the things that we see is that you have, let's say, federally recognized tribes living within a state, but the Indigenous food ecosystem crosses that state border or even that country border. So if we look at the Northwest region, the Pacific Northwest, we have tribes that consider themselves the salmon people. And traditionally they would migrate with the salmon runs that go up to up through Canada, and salmon are one of the only fish that ever migrate back home to where they were born. So throughout the seasons, you would have the tribes that go with the salmon run. But now once you have federal borders, once you have state borders, and you have tribes that are trying to sustain their cultural practices, but you don't have a passport, now what are those implications, right? And we have these examples like this all across the country, all across the states, and affecting many tribes. It's not always federal to state, but also just even passing state to state lines, even trying to, get the town to get on board with certain things. These are all barriers that we'll talk about to Indigenous food sovereignty. So what is food sovereignty? It's been this like really popular buzzword that's been really popular just in social media and in public discourse in the past couple of years. And while there's no universal definition for it, in simple terms, it can be described as the ability of communities to determine the quantity and quality of the food that they consume by controlling how their food is produced and distributed. In other words, the people that produce, distribute, and consume food also control the mechanisms and policies of food production and distribution. So I think that there's this kind of common assumption that food sovereignty is like, tribes just want to, at the most basic level, it's like growing food, but it's saying it also deals with having a say in like what we grow, how we grow it, and how we feed ourselves. And just an example of one way that this shows up is I've been working on a racial equity project in the organic movement on a national scale, and we've been having conversations with Native producers. And on one extreme end of the spectrum, there's the belief that food shouldn't be regulated because food is sacred and food is gifted. And we'll talk about those values later on. So even this concept of food sovereignty as control even is within friction of traditional values. So because there are so many federally recognized tribes, and each tribe and each nation is different, and has the right to govern themselves, food sovereignty will look different for Wampanoag people than it looks different for Lenape, or those who are in Oklahoma, or the Diné, or the Navajo. It's just, there's no real universal definition, because how it's implemented is going to look different on a case-by-case basis. Something that's kind of important very important to at least understand or have a background knowledge of is that tribal nations are recognized sovereigns. And this is important because ultimately food sovereignty is tied to tribal sovereignty, which refers to the right of American Indians and Alaska Natives to govern themselves. The US Constitution recognizes Indian tribes as distinct governments, and they have, with few exceptions, the same powers as federal and state governments to regulate their internal affairs. So this includes the right to establish your own form of government, determine membership requirements, enact legislation, establish law enforcement and court systems. And it's important to note that tribal sovereignty predates the formation of the United States and is recognized through the US Constitution in numerous federal statutes and court cases. So at the very core, tribal governments are responsible for the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens and their communities. So on this slide, you kind of see that, so you have a federal government, you have a foreign government, a state government, and tribal governments kind of float in between this in between. So yeah, it's like it's this weird situation where you are operating with outside of a system, but also within it. So it's kind of like a special designation. And this, we see a lot of friction with this every day. If you've paid attention to the news of, fights that Mashpee has had and Aquinnah has had with access to land and tribal rights and sovereign rights. Sometimes you have towns or local governments that are trying to regulate what tribes do, and the response, especially for Aquinnah and Mashpee, is that we're federally recognized tribes. So it's not just that we don't submit to local governments, we answer to the federal government because we're seen and viewed and operate as a federal foreign government, if that makes sense. It is a lot more complicated than this slide, but this is the most simple way I could break it down for the purposes of this talk. But I think it's important to know, because when you have a lot of either community members or organizational members or city departments that are really excited and eager to support Indigenous food sovereignty initiatives, it's not just that, like, a city will often come back and say, like, okay, here's what we need from you, and the tribe's response can rightfully so be, respectfully, we don't need to adhere to that. Like, we set the terms, and that's what sovereignty is all about. So just to keep that in mind. So some key principles of Indigenous food sovereignty is the idea of sacredness or divine sovereignty. So food is a gift from the Creator, and in this respect, the right to food is sacred and cannot be constrained or recalled by colonial laws, policies, or institutions. Indigenous food sovereignty, or if you hear me say IFS, that's just the condensed version that I'm saying, is fundamentally achieved by upholding our sacred responsibility to nurture healthy, interdependent relationships with the land, plants, and animals that provide us with our food. And a little bit later on, we're going to talk about the difference between the wage economy and the gift economy, and how that is often in friction with our modern day food system, and how that affects working with and supporting Indigenous food sovereignty movements, because there is friction there. IFS is participatory, it's not passive. It's fundamentally based on action, or the day-to-day practice of maintaining cultural harvesting strategies to maintain Indigenous food sovereignty as a living reality for both present and future generations. It requires continued participation at all of the individual, family, community, and regional levels. That's really critical. So pretty much across Indian country, there is a pretty widespread universal understanding that we always say in honor of the 7 generations that came before us, and for the benefit of the 7 generations to come after us. So when we talk about sovereignty, whether it's tribal sovereignty or specifically Indigenous food sovereignty, yes, there are responses to immediate and short-term needs, but the perspective of Indigenous communities is, will this benefit 7 generations out, or will it harm them? Will this threaten the continuity of our community, of our people, of our family, of our land, of our environment? That is key. And so if there's any initiative that will threaten that, you're not going to get the Indigenous community or the people organization, whatever it is, to be on board. I think a perfect example of this is the Dakota Access Pipeline. They were just like, for several reasons, no, but also like, you are disrupting sacred land, you are disrupting holy land, ceremonial land, and that will most likely lead to pollution of our land, air, and water. The answer is no. And we've seen that fight play out for the past few years. So just not saying that we are about Indigenous food sovereignty, but the actual act of that in our day-to-day actions, whether that's through harvesting, procuring, or consuming, is really critical to that. Number 3 is self-determination. So the ability to respond to our own needs for healthy, culturally adapted Indigenous foods. The ability to make decisions over the amount and quality of food that we hunt, fish, gather, grow, and eat. Freedom from dependence on grocery stores or corporately controlled food production, distribution, and consumption in industrialized economies. I also just want to note that there is a really key conversation here that's not talked about a lot, where there's Indigenous food security and also sovereignty. And it's not necessarily the case that one has to happen in front of the other, but oftentimes Indigenous communities are in a situation where it's like, we just need to feed our people first. We need to establish food security first, and then we can move on to sovereignty. Like, we have to feed people today. And then in tandem, while we're working on establishing food security, that's hopefully for the benefit and the health and nutrition of our people, how can we work to a place where we are not dependent on donations or the industrialized economy or grocery stores, things that we know that historically have not been in the best interest of our people. When we talk about the USDA and their commodity food boxes, when we talk about public health interventions that just miss the mark, sending dairy to tribal nations is just like, we are lactose intolerant. It's something that people don't really know, is that beef and chicken is actually not indigenous to North America. There's this really funny case study and I'm blanking on the name, but if you ask me about it later, I will Google it and I will find it for you. But there was this public health intervention where they like shipped cows to some Indigenous community in Canada, and cows are not Indigenous to Canada. Like, and it was an attempt to establish a little bit of more food security. And they go back to the tribe, and cows are just kind of like running all over the town, and they're like, what's happening? And they're like, you brought us these animals, and like, what do we do with them? Like, we're just kind of letting them roam free. But if you understood that cows aren't Indigenous to North America, then you wouldn't just randomly ship cows to Canada. Like, it was just an example of something that is very well-meaning, but just missing the mark. When we talk about the USDA and the government cheese, again, something that has never been traditional, but you have families and people that they are eating what they have to stay alive. And so why folks are so strongly, why they so strongly advocate for Indigenous food sovereignty is not only the revitalization of traditional foods, but the ceremonies that come with it, and the practices that accompany it as well. But we can talk more on that later. And then the fourth is policy. So Indigenous food sovereignty attempts to reconcile Indigenous food and cultural values with colonial laws and policies and mainstream economic activities. And therefore, the IFS framework is a restorative one for policy reform in forestry, fisheries, rangeland, environmental conservation, health, agriculture, rural and community development. Also a note on why land matters again. Something that's often not thought about is that all of your tribal reservations it was intentional that no tribal reservation is situated near an economic port, right? So now you have Indigenous health that is really synonymous now with rural health, because you weren't going to put people that you didn't see as humans in downtown Boston, in Chicago, in Atlanta. Like, they moved us away from these economic ports, and traditionally where we set up our villages and our communities were near economic ports. So it's like the US is set up on those migration patterns, on those traditional trade routes. A reason why Boston has a whole bunch of one-ways compared to other newer cities is because they were based on traditional routes, like whether they were hunting routes or just trade routes. Those were already carved out. So when they made Boston into a city, then they went over those routes with horse and buggy, and then eventually cars, and now we have a whole bunch of one-ways with no parking. So that's how we ended up where we are. But going back to the main point, policy really underlines the Indigenous food sovereignty movement. So I actually want to go to the difference in value orientations first. So a huge thing that I think trips people up when trying to wrap their head around Indigenous food sovereignty and how to engage with it in a respectful way is that there's no understanding that, or there's very limited understanding that fundamentally we are just coming from two totally different places a lot of the times. So value orientations are often formed by religious beliefs. And this is usually the part of the talk where people kind of clench up and they're like, what is she going to say? Because we talk a little bit about religious undertones. But it's just a reality. There are cultures all over the world that have a spiritual dimension or spiritual perspective to it. And this is just the reality. Religious teachings provide moral guidelines for followers. Religions often establish humans' existence in relation to the rest of the living world. And they have a remarkable impact upon standards of behavioral decisions because followers adapt behaviors according to social expectations of religious institutions. And religious teachings guide ethics and values. These learned values are then demonstrated in personal behaviors, public behaviors, and policy determinations. And because we're focusing on tribal communities in North America, our discussion will be more towards Christianity. So it is said that the United States is based on Christian beliefs. And so when we think about our relationships and who we are a relationship to, the Judeo-Christianity foundation is actually really important in the conversation around food and how we relate to it. So there are two value orientations that are not perfect, but I think the closest for the purposes of this conversation of how environmental value orientations of human societies can be categorized in three ways. So you have dominion over, submission to, and harmony with. So on the right side of this screen, you see anthropocentrism, which essentially is the dominion over nature belief. It's introduced in the Judeo-Christian creation story, which says that human beings were created in God's image and closer to the creator than the rest of creation. So we think of the cross, right? Like you are in higher relations to this than you are this way. And that's how we have the cross. This argument is based on the book of Genesis. The placement of nature and animal beings is under human dominion. So anthropocentrism places the primary value of nature in service to humans. Now, when I'm talking about this, I'm not saying this with a critical lens, or I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. I'm just saying that this is where we're connecting the dots over here. And then you have submission to nature, which is essentially just, the earth leads and we follow, and we don't really have a say in how we engage with it. We are just always in reaction to it. And then you have biocentrism, which I have found so far is the closest to traditional native beliefs, where it's that we are in harmony with nature. So it's not that we have dominion, it's not that we're completely submitting, but how do we work within the system? And we're going to speak on the difference between stewardship versus ownership later. But this left side of the screen, I think, is more of a representation of being in harmony. And although religion and spirituality differ between tribes and nations, one thing that is consistent across the board is that we're relational people. Traditional tribal values contain themes of ecological interconnectedness to guide reciprocal relationships with the natural world. And like I said, we're going to talk about stewardship versus ownership a little bit later. But there's this commonality of reverence and honor of the earth, and lands and places are held in the highest spiritual meaning. I think that something that is, it's not talked about, but kind of culturally accepted across the board, is that when we talk about Mother Nature, it's like this, like, woo-woo, life is amazing, like, let's just live in harmony with nature. And it sounds like this beautiful, really easygoing concept. But we live in a domesticated world. We live, for the most part, in domesticated nature. We are not used to seeing how violent nature can be until sometimes we call that natural disasters, or just observing animals in the wild. We see it all the time when it's just like, no, you can't just like approach lions on your safari. Like, we see these examples now on social media, but it's violent. Nature can be violent. It can be extreme. When we talk about extreme heat or extreme cold, or just the cycles that nature goes through, the traditional tribal or indigenous reaction to that is like, how do we be in harmony with this? And how do we honor the fact that the earth will go through these cycles of extreme, whatever that looks like. And of course, we as humans have contributed to the extreme polar things that we are experiencing right now. But the polarity of nature itself and the environment itself has never been lost on tribal people or indigenous people. And that's why we have certain ceremonies. That's why we have prayers. That's why we have ways of doing things in traditional practices, because we recognize that, one, if nature can be very violent at times and food is a gift and we are to live in harmony with it, then we need to be stewards of it. And that even speaks to how we respond to hunger, and what we've found out about hunger knowledges and hunger cultures, which is a totally different talk. But to move on to Indigenous values. So we are relational people, respect for each other. I will also say, going back to biocentrism in terms of like us just living in harmony with nature, that we're not above or below, but with that respect for our human and non-human relatives is really important. And that's in direct contrast with the Christianity basis that says that like you are with God and you are with each other. There's no room in Christianity for your non-human relatives. So when we talk about Indigenous values of respect, it's recognizing that we have respect for our Creator, the earth, our animal relatives, our non-human relatives, which are our spirit relatives, and so on and so forth. Reciprocity, a common saying, only take what you need, use all that you take, and always give thanks. Responsibility, again, to that stewardship, resilience, and resistance. And then we have overarching themes of balance, interconnectedness, and seasonality. We live in a world right now, for the most part, of extreme abundance, to the point where we have decision fatigue. But understanding that when we are living in harmony with nature, the reality is that we didn't have access to meat all the time. There was a time for an abundance of meat, of hunting season. And then of course we would dry some and preserve some, but you literally eating with the seasons is more than just, you know, what you see on Instagram. It's what is available. And by today's standards, that might be considered food insecurity. But when we go back to those value orientations, it's really just being in harmony with the gifts that we have around us. And when you see everything as a gift, and when you look to live in harmony with your environment and the place that you know, the place that you come from, like I said earlier, my blood and my DNA is from this land, not that I just live here, but I came from here. You have a different understanding and a different knowing of your surroundings and a reverence for it. So these values and themes are important because it guides how you respond to food sovereignty, security, hunger, and other food-related environmental issues. So another really important distinction is this difference between ownership and stewardship. So from a settler perspective, and I'm bringing this back a little bit into history because these are still themes that we see today. There was this perception that land was an empty wilderness to reproduce or to be transformed. Land was a commodity, an item which could be bought and sold and assigned to an individual owner. That's why when we see stories about like how much Manhattan was bought for, quote unquote, bought for like $24 or whatever it was, it's not because that they're like, oh, this is what we value the land at. It's because the traditional thought is that like you can't own land. Like this concept of like, now this is mine is just in direct contradiction with the values of stewardship of like, this is the place where I am and this is what I take care of. Ownership of land or people was just not really a thing. So in 1722, we have a quote here by the Puritan minister, Reverend Samuel Stoddard of Boston, who justifies the colonist acquisition of Indian land for little to no payment, as the Indians made no use of it but for hunting. Or we see Baptist Reverend John Callender of Rhode Island explaining that by driving out and killing the Indians as punishment for their sins, God was pleased to make a place prepared for us as an asylum. So this justification of land and just totally missing the mark of how Native people see the land and how they honor the land. And for somebody or a group of people to come in and just say, like, you've done nothing with this but hunt because you don't see stone walls and perfectly manicured grass. There's also accounts from settlers that were saying that like it was just viewed as wilderness, but we don't have a word for wilderness. There's different ways of taking care of the land, and I think that now in 2023, in the past few years, we've seen us come back to farmers wanting to know about Indigenous farming practices or just ways of taking care of the land because it worked. And now sometimes it's called regenerative, whatever that word is, agriculture, or from the regulatory standpoint, we call it organic, right? In some ways, shape, form, or fashion. So something that you can think about is, how do you interact with your landscape? And what relationships do you have with your landscape, if any? And when you start to think about those things, you can start to think about how you interact with your environment, with your food, and everything that happens within that food ecosystem. I promise we're almost done. I know there's a lot of information, but I also wanted to touch on the wage versus the gift economy. So also when colonists came over, you bring so much more with you than just physical bodies when you cross borders, whatever that is. You bring your culture, you bring your religious beliefs, you bring your economic beliefs, how you view health, food, sickness, and the reasons behind that. All of that matters. So something that they brought with them was this wage economy, which was the exchange of money for ownership. And we just talked a little bit about like how that wasn't traditional. And that's because the traditional standpoint is that we come from gift economies, which often rely on intangible rewards, like a sense of contribution, community, honor, or prestige. And so it's said that gratitude and reciprocity are the currency of a gift economy. So if our first response is gratitude, then our second response is to reciprocate, right? So earlier I said, only take what you need, use all that you take, and always give thanks. There are different ceremonies for offering for when you really do anything, but especially when it comes to food procurement, hunting, fishing, gathering, whatever, is that you always thank the creator, you always thank the animal for sacrificing their life. You thank the environment around you for producing this plant. When we talk about consent, even consent isn't just for our human relatives. When you go to tap maple trees, you ask the maple tree, will you share your sap with me? And the maple tree can say no. And if the maple tree says no, then you respect it, you still leave your offering, and then you go on to the next one. Like this to kind of connect the dots here, going back to that value orientation of dominion over nature, how that would have played out is, I'm tapping this tree and I'm going to tap until I find a place where I get the sap, right? Where like there is no relationship, there is no respect. It's, I need this and you are going to give it to me because I know you have it, right? And that is just a totally different value orientation of like, thank you for sharing this with me. And in response to this, like, this is what I will share with you, right? So this reciprocity is just super important. So just to kind of wrap this up, some barriers to Indigenous food sovereignty. We've talked about borders, whether that's state borders, town borders, international borders, regulation. The regulation, I know that this is a huge conversation in the organic movement right now. There is a push to increase BIPOC farmers in the organic movement. I know because I'm working on the project. And something that they're saying is that like if food is a gift and food doesn't have to be shared with us, then who are we to regulate it, right? So again, that concept of regulating is that dominion over value orientation. And then we have environmental pollution, like we talked about with the pipelines, or just different initiatives that are a direct contradiction with the continuity of Indigenous sovereignty that ultimately affects food. So we also see this a lot with oil spills. You know, there's a really sad number of stories about water being polluted by industrialized nations, companies, whatever you want to call it, and folks still fishing and still hunting in their traditional riverways and those bodies of water and getting cancer because of greed, and because nobody listened when they say like, hey, like, you're poisoning us, right? Those conversations. Active prohibition of hunting, fishing, and farming. Something that I always share, because I know that it can be intimidating to hear all of this and then to be like, well, Ryan, what the heck am I supposed to do? Like, I am just one person, or, you know, I don't know how my organization can help with this. I always share the example of a cousin that I have that basically has a gentleman's agreement or a handshake agreement with a private landowner who has access to a lot of acres of land that have maple trees on them. And whether or not the landowner knew he had maple trees, didn't know how to identify trees, or didn't have a use for them, essentially lets my cousin and his family set up maple camp every year. And that's just a private landowner to a private citizen agreement. And so every winter, him and his family, they set up maple camp, and they teach their children that tradition and the cultural practices and those land-based practices. Another huge thing that has been that we've been really advocating for is a lot of harassment of our Indigenous citizens today in 2023, not being able to practice their right to fish. You know, folks being harassed to see their federal tribal citizenship card, or even when you show identification, that they're still being harassed, or very racist remarks, especially down on the Cape. Lack of access to land and discriminatory farm lending practices, also a huge barrier. One thing that I thought was really amazing, I won't share her name because I just thought of this now, but when she got a new job on a farm, she negotiated as a part of her package that on the farm they would have a certain number of acres where they could plant Indigenous crops, and that tribal members would have access to that land to learn those land-based practices, those cultural ceremonies, and X, Y, and Z. So there are some barriers, but there are also ways to interact and to engage and to help by being an ally and an advocate. We'll skip this because we're a little short on time, but some reflection questions that I wanted to leave you with is, what or who am I in relationship with? How am I in relation to the food that I eat? What are my responsibilities? what does honor look like in my dietary practices? What does sacrifice look like in my dietary practices? And what is sacred to me? I think a really huge conversation, or just something that we're just like not connecting the dots on when it comes to cultural appropriation, is that a lot of people are disconnected to themselves, and so they want to attach to something that is traditionally with another group that is sacred to that group. But what is sacred to you is sacred to you. Like, and I say this, the example that I always give is with smudging. Where it's like, if you don't know the ceremony or the cultural context behind smudging, it's just aromatherapy because that meaning isn't there, because that connection to that medicine isn't there anymore. And so sure, you can burn sage or you can burn cedar, but it's like, if you are burning these medicines for the benefits that are traditionally to Indigenous people, like, you're missing the mark. It's going to smell good. But it's just not there. So when I ask people to think about what is sacred to me, it's like, when you look within yourself, like, what do you hold close to your heart? What do you really value? And create your own ceremonies around that, create your own practices around that, instead of trying to adopt or appropriate something that is being held by a certain group of people and that is trying to be protected by a certain group of people. So I will leave you with that. I give you a lot of information. So good top of time for joining. Thank you all for joining. If you have any questions or ever want to chat further, I'm happy to do so. There is my email. You can also find me on LinkedIn if you want to feel fancy. But thank you for joining today, and I really appreciate sharing this space with you. I guess if there's any immediate questions, happy to answer some.
Yeah, I think we can take a couple minutes if anybody has maybe 1 or 2 questions for Ryan.
Okay, not a problem. So I think now, if I'm correct, we are going into breakout rooms. And in your breakout rooms,
Will you share
can...
will you share hosting with me, Ryan?
Oh shoot, yes.
I can set them up. And then you can continue with what you were saying.
Yes. Okay, I think I did that. So in your breakout rooms, you can just take about 15 minutes to debrief from all that you've learned today. And also, if it brought up some ideas of like, hey, this is how I think I could contribute to the food sovereignty movement, or this is what I think I could do from my organization standpoint, whether that's food donations or from an individual, if you have access to land, you can kind of bounce those ideas off of each other.
Great. So we'll go into breakout rooms now, and we'll be in for a little more than 10 minutes. And then we'll come back together for community updates and next steps. Ryan, I just want to say out loud, thank you so much. That was incredible. So, and I hope you're seeing all of the love for you in the comments. Thank you. Hello. I don't know how we ended up in just a room together.
I denied the breakout room for a second. Oh my gosh. Man.
That was awesome.
I'm glad. I'm always nervous, and like, you can really tell I'm an introvert because like my voice gets super hoarse. I'm not used to talking that long.
Incredible. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
It is.
you.
I just want to say to you that I because I lived in Seattle for 15, 16 years. Did my own 20-year-old white girl's version of cultural appropriation. I'm proud of it, but I did it trendy on the West Coast. But also the conversation around tribal sovereignty and tribes is so different here versus there.
Really? I imagine so.
Hi, Christine.
Hey,
Who else do we have? Oh, we do have one more person.
beautifully done, Ryan.
Thank you. Please let me know if it was overwhelming. I'm like, there's so much, but I think like to have just a
Perfect.
I think. All right, great. So everybody should be back. Once again, thank you, Eliza and Ryan, and thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. It's been just a really great evening and a great time to get back together again in our quarterly meeting. Cheryl, do you have community updates?
I didn't see any in the chat, but does anyone have community updates that they may want to share real quickly? Okay, if not, it's okay.
I did want to ask, when is the Ryan fan club opening up? Like, who wants to be the president?
It's open now.
Cool. I want the invite in the email, okay?
Amazing. And I will share for now. Sorry. Musu?
Most of you, if you're not able to, I can share the next steps and action items.
Nope, I'm here. Nope,
Oh,
I'm here.
okay, there you go.
Thank you. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you. Next steps and action items. The next BFAC meeting is June 6, 2023. The 2023 schedule is meeting schedule. Become a member, join a working group, email BFAC if you're interested in data and networking, fundraising, or COEE, co-chair position. Interns for the BFAC this summer. If you have any questions, the office, just email us at office@bostonfoodaccesscouncil.org. Check out BFAC's website and follow us on your social media.
Great. And then Lexi or Chloe, will you share a little bit about the upcoming policy and advocacy meeting?
Yeah, hi. So we're going to have kind of a follow-up meeting to our CFC on SNAP and SNAP Dignity. This meeting's going to happen on the 21st, so I believe it's exactly 2 weeks from today, at 6 p.m., so about 6 to 7 p.m. And we're essentially hoping to just debrief what happened at the CFC and kind of the main ideas. And we'd really like to invite anyone who has, as a stakeholder in this kind of work, SNAP, HIP, WIC, and also anyone interested in moving forward with any action items. And our hope is that we can kind of identify some actions along with some interested folks and move forward on some SNAP policy, create maybe an agenda, and start to take some next steps in terms of advocacy and policy. So we highly recommend you join us. If you enjoyed the CFC, or even if you weren't there and you would like to hear a debrief and a rundown and get involved. So yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone. With that, I'll just share our final screen just with all of our socials and our handles and that sort of thing. But we are closed for tonight, and please be in touch with us and reach out with any questions. And feel free to, there's everybody's email is in the chat if you have additional questions. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Good
much.
night.
Good night.
Good night.
I couldn't get back to share.
Yeah.